Is your van or RV too old for full-timing? How old is too old for a van or RV? Well, we'll talk about this question here more coming up. It's a question that I am asked frequently. How old is too old when it comes to a van or RV? And it's a good question too, because RVs are expensive, vans are expensive, and usually it's less expensive up front at least to purchase an older model vehicle. But at what point does a rig become too old where it's just not reasonable to purchase or plan on using reliably any longer? Well, you're listening to the Robert Witham Show, a weekly podcast where we discuss things like travel, the nomadic lifestyle, simple living, and minimalism. I'm your host, Robert Witham, and welcome to episode 2. We'll kick off again with Nomad News, and by Nomad News I mean stories from the news that are of interest or concern to nomads or other frequent travelers. Up first this week, a report from KOLD News 13 in Tucson, Arizona, that valley fever cases have been increasing quite a bit this year. The Arizona Department of Health Services is reporting 6,414 diagnosed cases as of August 27th, which is up from 5,260 at the same time last year. So that's an increase of more than 1,000, about 1,200 more at the same time from last year. So you may be asking yourself, what on earth is valley fever? I'd never heard of it till I started going to the desert, and when I first did hear about it, it was always in context of dogs. I didn't even know it affected people at first. Well, valley fever is a lung infection that is caused by a fungus that is found in the soil in the desert southwest. Most people who contract valley fever, fortunately, don't even have symptoms. Like 60% apparently don't even have symptoms. They just recover without any kind of medical intervention. But about 40% do develop symptoms. And loosely speaking, I'm not a doctor here, but I would loosely speaking describe them as being flu-like symptoms, but I'll have the list of that and more information in the show notes if you want more information about it, but I won't bore everybody with it here. Some cases, unfortunately, can become severe, but it may require some, more involved medical treatment. So why the increase this year? That's like the big question, right? Well, nobody's certain, but one possibility, or one thing that at least likely plays a role for part of it, if not all of it, is that there's been a push starting last year to better educate healthcare providers about valley fever and what to expect with it and how to diagnose it. And so they think that may be part of it. It may just be a case of people looking for it more careful, healthcare providers looking for it more aggressively this year. So that may be part of it, where in the past it may have been, some of those cases may have been misdiagnosed as other things. So should you avoid the desert out of concern for valley fever? Well, I know some people do. I've had people write to me and tell me that they do stay away for that reason. But this is a decision that each person needs to make for himself or herself. I would not presume to tell you should or should not go to the desert based on a concern about valley fever or any other particular concern, unless I thought it was like a legitimate, a big enough risk. I would say so. My opinion, there are risks everywhere, from natural disasters like hurricanes, tornadoes, earthquakes, what have you, to disease-carrying insects. My folks live in Massachusetts. They're having an issue with EEE. It's an encephalopathy. I think, don't quote me on that, and I didn't look up the full name before I broadcast this, but they're having an increase in cases of that. So we got West Nile virus from mosquitoes, all kinds of things. So I mean, there's risks everywhere, and that's before we even start getting into things like car crashes, right? So by context, in Arizona, the last year I could find statistics for readily was from 2005, and they had more than 70,000 injuries from motor vehicle crashes and more than 1,000 fatalities. So if you compare just a comparison of valley fever to car crashes, I'm far more worried about being involved in a car crash from a reckless driver in Arizona than I am about contracting valley fever while I'm there. That's my perspective. I like to look at things, raw data like that, but it's just not something that worries me considerably. I'm aware of it, and if I developed respiratory or related issues while I was in Arizona, I certainly would seek medical attention to make sure I didn't have something like that going on. What can you do to protect yourself? Well, since the fungus lives in the soil. As long as it's not disturbed, there's nothing to worry about. But sometimes it is. It becomes a threat to humans and to dogs when it's airborne, when it becomes airborne. This is why dogs are particularly susceptible to valley fever, because some of them like to dig, and if there's I'm not going to attempt to pronounce the fungus that causes valley fever, but if that's in the soil and they're digging and breathing at the same time as a fungus is being stirred up and becoming airborne, that's why they're susceptible to it. So the big thing for humans, avoid digging in the dirt. And if you do, wear an appropriate mask or other protection, respiratory protection, and shelter inside during dust storms. You do sometimes get those down there. The wind's blowing, it's stirring up dust, even if it's not a full-blown heavy-duty dust storm. If you stay inside, or again, wear protection over your nose and mouth so that you're not breathing in those fungal spores. And that's really the best way to protect yourself, other than just being aware of the symptoms. And if you had to begin to develop those symptoms, see a doctor and make sure they can check and make sure that you don't have a problem there. I promised after the last episode we had some unpleasant news about someone shooting burros in San Bernardino County, California. I said we'd get something good this time, and I did. So catch this. There was a surprise visitor in a ladies' room at a lodge in Montana. Yes. CNN Travel reported recently on a surprise visitor in the ladies' room at Buck's T4 Lodge in Big Sky, Montana. Apparently a young black bear was found relaxing on the counter in the restroom. Evidently, this bear made its way into the lodge through a small window in the wall, and it was too high for it to get back to let itself out again. So it was discovered by, I'm not sure if it was an employee or a guest, but they discovered it lounging on the counter in the washroom. So the Gallatin County Sheriff's Office and Montana Fish, Wildlife, and Parks both responded. They were able to safely tranquilize the yearling bear and transport it to another area of the state to rehome it. So hopefully we'll not be revisiting the lodge. So there's your Nomad news for episode 2. Which now, how old is too old? We talked about that earlier, that question. Vans and RVs are expensive. There's no question about it. Vans in particular are becoming hard to find at a decent price due to the surge in popularity from the van dwelling movement. It used to be vans were a dime a dozen, they were cheap, people couldn't get rid of them, and now all of a sudden they're being bought up left and right for people who want to use them full-time or part-time for travel, and it's become harder to find and more expensive, especially for anything that's in decent shape. Vans that are beat to death are going for ridiculous prices, let alone one in good condition. So how old is too old? This trend causes many budget-conscious people to look at older vehicles that are less expensive to purchase. So, what you thought you might have wanted to buy is thousands out of your price range. You start looking at stuff that's a little bit older that maybe you can get a better deal on. But that brings us to the obvious question: how old is too old? When is a van or an RV too old to be considered a valid option for full-timing or at least for extended travel? Bottom line, unfortunately, is that there's no simple answer to this question. I wish there was. I would love to be the guru who could tell you this is the cutoff year where you don't want to buy anything older than that. It would make things easier, and it would certainly be convenient for anybody who's thinking about buying a van or an RV. My recommendation is always, you may have heard me say this before if you've been following along for any length of time, my recommendation is always to buy the newest vehicle and the best maintained vehicle you can reasonably afford. And in my opinion, when it comes down to the scale, if budget's a concern, I would sacrifice comfort for a more reliable vehicle. What I mean by that is I might want an RV, but if I could buy a far better van for my dollars, I would go with a van and have less comfort and at least know that I was getting a more reliable vehicle. Or similarly, if I was a toss-up between a high top and a standard roof van, and the standard roof was newer and had been far better maintained, that's the one I'd go for if the budget was tight and I had to make that decision, because rather than buying a vehicle that's just not in as good a condition and is going to be more prone to breakdowns and expensive maintenance costs. As a general rule, newer is going to be preferable, but maintenance does come in. Older vehicles are more likely to need more maintenance and to break down more often. So that's just something to be aware of. You can save money up front on the purchase price, but you're likely to spend that money later on in maintenance costs and tow bills possibly. Vehicles that have been well maintained, though, are almost always going to be cheaper to operate in the long term than those that have been neglected or especially abused. And if you don't know how to look for that yourself, bring somebody with you that does. Pay a mechanic that's an independent person to look at it and look everything over for you. They can tell if it's been well maintained. It helps. Sometimes you'll get a stack of receipts that shows the kind of stuff that's been done. That helps you know if it's been well maintained. Fleet vehicles sometimes are well maintained, not always, but sometimes they're well maintained. And again, they should have paperwork for it if that's the case. Okay, another thing to consider with older vehicles when you're talking how old is too old is that they do reach a point where parts are going to be harder to find. That's probably not going to be an issue on a 10-year-old vehicle, but you start getting into vehicles that are 30 years old, you're going to sometimes have a hard time finding parts. And that brings you back to, if you're talking about a Chevy van, a Ford van, they're going to be a lot easier to find parts for when they're older than some other less popular vehicles, just because there were so many of them on the road. Another thing to think about here when you talk about how old is too old is, are you buying it from someone that it's exposed to road salt, whether it has been exposed to road salt. If you're in upstate New York, where I used to live, some places in the Midwest, 10 years old, you might be sending cars to the junkyard because they're so rotted out. So you can buy a vehicle out here, out in the West, that doesn't have road salt, never seen salt. It's going to last a lot longer. My brother and sister-in-law just bought a vintage, it's 1960-something Chevy pickup truck from California. Had to ship back to New York. They've been wanting one for a long time. Really cool old truck. Not a speck of rust on it, not a speck of rust underneath. It's just pristine, and that's because it never seen salt in its life. So that matters a lot too. Think about that when you're buying something that's exposed to a salt that is going to affect the lifespan of the vehicle, not because of the mechanicals, but because of the rust eating everything out from underneath. So I say this as somebody who drives older vehicles. My current vehicle is a 1993 Ford van. It's an E150. Funny story, I was just recently looking up a part to get a fuel pressure regulator, and I was trying to figure out if it was the base package or the LT. I thought it ought to be LT because it's got all the air and power windows and locks and luxury seats, but it doesn't have the LT badge on it. And I was checking the nameplate, and lo and behold, because it's a conversion van, it actually is a Ford RV prep package van. So it was sold incomplete to Sherrod, who did the build out in the back as a conversion van. So funny story there, but it's a 1993, and it's got 120,000 miles on it. That's pretty low miles for a lot of vehicles these days. Last car I had was a 2001 Toyota Echo. That thing had over 200,000 miles on it when I got rid of it. We drove that all over, and the only real substantial work I did on it was we had to put a transmission in it. The transmission failed the first, 6 months after we got it or something, so we had to replace that. And other than that, a few minor repairs, nothing big at all. Never left me stranded, other than when I left the headlights on in Vegas. We were at a conference, but other than that, never left me stranded. Before that, I had a 2001, I think, Chrysler Town & Country minivan, which had, I think it was 246,000 when I sold it. It was pushing $250,000 in any case. And I sold that to a lovely lady in Arizona who's a viewer. Shout out to Peaches here. She's still driving it. So, I've driven, these are all older and higher mileage vehicles. I've driven them all over the country. But they were all very well maintained when I purchased them. Every one of them had been very well maintained. And that had a lot to do with how they lasted and how much money I had to put into them. I've also seen people, and maybe you have too, who are traveling in full-time in vintage vans and buses and RVs and stuff, and that's always really cool. Truth is, at the same time, you're probably going to spend just as much in maintenance on a vehicle like that as you would to buy a much newer vehicle. Again, you're getting into obsolete parts and more frequent breakdown, and weird things break. When you start getting really old, weird stuff breaks. Things that don't fail on newer vehicles. So I got a checklist here that I'll mention. This is not rocket science. It's not any kind of gospel or anything, but this is my opinion. 4 points. 1, buy as new a vehicle as you can reasonably afford. I don't necessarily recommend going to debt to buy something, but buy the best you can reasonably afford on your budget. Second, choose dependability over comfort. when you have to choose, I'm not saying you always have to choose, but if you have to make that choice, I would choose dependability over comfort, and then upgrade in the future when the budget allowed. Third, I will purchase only a well-maintained vehicle, and get an opinion on that from somebody that knows. Take your time, make sure it's well-maintained, and then snap it up if it's a really good vehicle that's been well-maintained. That you won't regret that. That'll save you a ton of money and aggravation down the road. And then finally, maintain an emergency fund for major repairs, regardless of the vehicle age. I've heard enough stories recently of people with vehicles only 4, 5, 6 years old that had needed thousands of dollars worth of repairs, far more than I've spent on a vehicle in I don't know how long. Yes, on average, you're more likely to run into big repairs on an older vehicle, but that's not, age isn't necessarily a guarantee, nor the mileage on the odometer. So regardless of the vehicle age, try and have an emergency fund to cover those unexpected problems that come up. And that's a challenge for a lot of us. You don't always have it, but to the extent you're able to, try and do that. And that'll help you out when something does come up. Because most anything with a vehicle, you can fix it with a little bit of cash, and you either fix the vehicle or replace it with something else. So a lot of the worries that come around breakdowns on the road really come down to having a little bit of money to take care of something if it does happen. That's when it's terrifying, is when you're out of the road and you don't have any money. If you got some money, it's just irritating because you had to draw down your savings to fix it or to replace the vehicle. But you can take care of it and be back on the road. So listener questions. Had a couple this week. One from, I'm not sure if I'm going to pronounce it, Sivs or Sives. What are some handy or most used phone apps used for planning a trip? And this follows up on from the first podcast where I mentioned doing some custom trip planning using custom Google Maps. So my list, real briefly, this isn't exhaustive, but these are the ones I use most often. It's going to be Google Maps. I have Apple Maps on my phone, but it likes to get me lost. And worse yet, Google Maps is very good at having Forest Service and BLM roads on the map and indicated. Apple Maps almost never does, since I spend a lot of time driving off-road. In the Gambler 500 world, they say pavement is lava. But since I spend a lot of time driving on primitive roads, Google Maps is much more useful to me than Apple Maps. Campendium is a big one I use. They have a website too, but they also have a native iOS app, I believe. Possibly for Android, I'm not sure. But they do have a native iOS app, which is really convenient right on your phone. And that's my number one go-to spot to look up campsites when I'm wanting to find something somewhere else has been. I also often go out exploring and find my own. But when I'm just traveling and wanting to find some stuff, like on this trip, going to the desert, I'm trying to stick along a more or less straight line, and I'm trying not to do a lot of extra miles to save gas and to reduce wear and mileage on the van, because I'm in a dry spell for my work right now. So the last thing I want to do is put extra miles in the van and break down somewhere. So I'm trying to limit that. So I'm using tools like Campendium to find a whole list of campsites where I'm going to be going, and then I'm plugging them into my Google Map, so I can see at a glance where all the available upcoming camping is. And there are a few spots, for example, where there's a gap of 50 or 100 miles before I got any leads on anything. There isn't really anything around, and then there's a whole bunch packed in tighter again. So it gives me flexibility that way. It makes it easy to research. I also use U.S. Public Lands, which is an app from Two Steps Beyond Media. That's Chris and Cherie of Technomadia fame. But it's a map of the U.S. with an overlays for the different public lands, Forest Service, BLM, whatever. So you can see at a glance, and it's GPS enabled, so you can see at a glance where you are in relation to public land, which is really handy when you're in an area and you think, I think that's probably BLM over there. Oh yeah, so it is, and you can go over and check out for some camping. So that's really helpful. Coverage is another one, also by Two Steps Beyond, and coverage is like public lands, but it's for cell phone coverage, and so they overlay maps from all the major carriers, but with much better detail than the carriers provide. If you ever look at the carrier maps, the carrier coverage maps, aside from being hidden and buried in their website, they don't do a very good job of putting roads and cities and things on there, so it's very hard to see with any accuracy where you're actually may have coverage. And so then again, that's only an estimate of where you might have it. It doesn't mean you will for sure, but it does help with planning. Because if I look at that and there's somewhere I'm planning, thinking about camping, and I look at that and it goes, oh, it says there's no coverage, well, I'm not even going to bother, because except for maybe an occasional overnight, because I know I need a signal. So coverage is really helpful. Another one I've been using recently that's a new kid on the block is iOverlander. There's more geared at the 4x4 and overland crowd, but they do still have some good listings. A lot of times they're the same things you'll see on Campendium or free campsites, but they also have some unique ones. And I found several, for example, on this trip I'm doing right now that were not on any of the other databases. So that's a good one, and just keep in mind that a lot of them, people who are using that, are overlanders, so they are probably driving 4x4s and lifted vehicles that so it may keep that in mind when you're looking at it. And then finally, another one I use a lot is not actually an app, but freecampsites.net. That's the website, and you can use it on your mobile phone, but they don't have a native app yet. So that's those are kind of the big ones that I use. There's a bunch of others I use occasionally. I might mention Sensorly and Open Signals apps for speed tests. I do use those as well. So when I get to a site I'm considering camping, I can do a quick test and see what the speed's like. And I tested on both Verizon and my AT&T hotspot, so I know what kind of signal I'm looking at. If it's terrible, I'm going to keep going. If it's really good, then that's great. And sometimes if it's in the middle, it's like it's okay, but it's not amazing, but I'm having a hard time finding a place, then I may assume I'm going to get enough with a booster and give it a try at that point. And I had multiple comments, not so much questions, but multiple comments from people requesting a video about making a custom travel map using Google Maps. So I am going to be working on that soon. I just got to figure out how I want to do that to demonstrate the things and show everybody how I do that. It's only something I learned very recently myself, so I'll be glad to share that, because it's a super useful tool, easy to use once you get the hang of it, and very useful for planning trips and stuff. And then one more comment from, not a question, but my friend Mark, Adventures with Jane. Excellent, love the podcast format. I also plan my travels by temp, but 20 degrees Fahrenheit hotter. Planning to put on a queue in October. Hope to maybe see you down the road. Safe travels, Mark. Yeah, Mark likes weather a little warmer than I do, and that's the great thing about being a nomad, is you can plan your travels around the weather that works for you, not the weather that works for everybody else. So I know people like it colder, people like it hotter. I personally kind of like, mid-60s, 60s somewhere, and 40s at night. That's kind of my ideal, but obviously it's hard to get that year round, but that's kind of my ideal. So yeah, Mark's going to be hoping to be in Quartzsite in October. I will not be in Quartzsite in October. I will be there this winter, but it's not going to be till a little later, because even in November it's usually too hot. But maybe mid-November, early December, we'll see. I got to be there early December, but we'll see beyond that. So well, anyway, I hope you enjoyed this podcast. If so, if you're watching on YouTube, please hit the like button. That really helps. And please consider subscribing, and wherever it is you're seeing this. If you're watching on YouTube, hit the subscribe button and then ring the little bell so you'll be notified when I publish new podcasts or other travel-related videos. And if you're listening to it on your mobile device with a podcast service, you can subscribe there. You can also catch this on my website. It'd be robertwitham.com/episode 2, and you can listen to it there and see the full show notes there as well. Then if you're on, if you're listening to it on YouTube or through a podcast service, please consider leaving a comment if you enjoyed this. Those really help other people decide if this is something they might want to take their time to listen to. But in conclusion, thanks for joining me for this podcast, everybody. I hope that you found it entertaining and informative, and we will visit again next week in episode 3. And if there's anything you have questions about anything, please feel free to leave them in the comments on YouTube or in the comments on underneath the show notes on my website. Again, robertwitham.com/episode 2. Go ahead and leave your comments in either place, and we can answer them and answer any questions in episode 3. So thanks for joining me. We'll see you next week in episode 3. But make sure that it's well maintained.